right, howdy.
Howdy.
All that good stuff. So my overall topic for this was water. And narrowing that down, it was rethinking the wastewater landscapes within our cities. Just in case y'all actually want the APA style of the articles. But that center one, the Smith article, if you're following along, that's my primary article. That's the one that I'm going to be spending the vast majority of the time talking about. The other two have some supporting information, but if you want to get into the details of those, then that will be more interesting to you on an individual basis. So, starting off, the way I'm going to do this is we're going to start with that primary article and really get into the meat of this topic, the Rethinking Wastewater Landscapes. This article is about conceptual implementation. And then the other two, in order to support that, the performance of a constructed wetland pond system, that's going to get into a real-world project with real-world metrics. So I wanted to have our conceptual idea and then back it up with an actual case study that is in the ground. And then moving into the adaptation of sewer networks, that is moving out of the world of the wetland construction and into other innovations within the grander scheme of wastewater management that are also moving in the same directions with like adaptation. So, beginning then with rethinking wastewater landscapes, combining the innovative strategies to address tomorrow's urban wastewater treatment challenges. So those challenges that are lined up in this article by Smith, urbanization, we're having more people concentrating in cities, climate change, we have those more people concentrating in cities at the same time that all of our storm events are escalating. So events like flooding are getting worse as time goes by. That becomes a huge issue when we have combined sewer overflows. I think that's in this class that's been mentioned where you have your stormwater management system is linked with your sewer system, so in a flood event you're getting some nasty stuff bubbling up into the streets. And then overall, there tends to be this disconnect between the world of engineering and the world of design. So you have these opportunities with wastewater management where they could serve both purposes, both function and form, but because of that disconnect, they don't. In the way this article broke down this huge concept, they began with 5 key design principles for actually designing these urban wastewater infrastructures. Then they actually created a proposed design for one in San Francisco. They actually went through a lot of the legal precedent and the rules and regulations in San Francisco to make a fairly realistic and fairly feasible design. So even though it is hypothetical, it's actually pretty useful. And then they also covered some case studies of existing systems. So, kicking off those design principles, there are 5 of them. In order for a wastewater management system to be really comprehensive, and the author's idea, it needs to be adaptive, it needs to be decentralized, it needs to be biomimetric, it needs to focus on reuse, and it needs to be multifunctional. And that is for it to be comprehensive, but as they said, it doesn't have to have every single one of these. In fact, the case studies they cover, none of them have every single one of these design principles. They can work together, or they can support each other, but they're all fairly critical. So beginning with being adaptive, in terms of being adaptive for climate change, these are designs that need to be modular and have interchangeable parts, so as the environment around it shifts, the structure itself can move as well. As the urban fabric around it shifts with changing land uses, then the wetlands themselves can be moved around and adjusted. Decentralization. This is essentially like with a power grid. Instead of having all of your power coming from one single source and then radiating out, if one thing goes wrong with that centralized system, then everybody's just out of luck. Similar concept here. Having these smaller, more localized impacts for your wastewater management, you lose the risk, or you lessen the risk of having just one huge catastrophic event wiping out your entire system. You also open yourselves up to customization and lowering the needs for maintenance on your citywide networks. Biomimetric, basically trying to mimic nature. So using a lot of these systems are based with vegetation and with microbes, and so they're essentially solar powered. once a pump gets the water into this reconstructed wetland, or I guess constructed wetland, then it's essentially based on natural processes. And so that's very inexpensive in terms of power input. And it's inexpensive in terms of getting these waters polished. I guess in the final stages, when you're getting out the latter end of the nutrients that you don't want in your final water, it's a much less expensive option than doing that more mechanically. And a lot of times these biometric systems serve as a complement to gray infrastructure. So for instance, here you can see the conventional system is cheaper up to a certain point, but then once you get to this area where you're really wanting to get more polished results, then it becomes less expensive to do your natural systems as opposed to like a really tertiary conventional traditional system. Then getting back into reuse as our fourth design principle, basically you're wanting to optimize your water supply. Not everything that we use potable water for needs potable water. Most plants that you're irrigating really don't need drinking water. They can have recycled rainwater and gray water. And so you're reducing that potable demand. This essentially is showing how our existing uses where we have our potable water here is sourcing irrigation, is sourcing toilets. For crying out loud, we don't need drinking water in our toilets. Just dogs do, I guess. And it's also being sourced through to drinking water. And also surface runoff is going directly to wastewater treatment plants because it's just hitting the street and running. Whereas opposed to an optimized system, you're collecting that surface runoff, and then your potable water supply is much more limited in what it's having to service. And then multifunctional, having spaces that can be educational, recreational, and can create habitats, especially within cities. We're losing more and more opportunities for habitat creation or preservation, so this is one opportunity to give it back. Okay, so those are the design principles. Here's the actual conceptual design that the authors came up with. So, taking you through, you start at the beginning and the water gets pumped in, and some storage, some detention basins, and then it winds its way through these habitat ponds and series, which are essentially some are just water basins and some have vegetation in them. And as the wastewater goes through this system, particulate matter falls out, nutrients get reabsorbed, and it gets cleansed. We have a pond here, a larger pond, that really lets the water really slow down and particulates fall out. And then eventually the water gets to exit relatively clean for uses in irrigation or simply to be reintroduced back into the water supply, but much cleaner. And for the design people in the audience, I promise I didn't do this rendering, so that's not my fault. This was from the article, but it's just a little bit more of a render of how you can see the interaction of the vegetation and the water, the actual sitting water within this design. So you're getting some of that biometric infused throughout. Those ponds in series, the first part, these guys, had a little bit of a breakdown of what that's starting to look like with your standing basins and your vegetated basins, and how they perform differently in different levels of inundation. Once you get to a certain point, then you lose some efficiency, but they do still maintain effectiveness in dry conditions and in wet weather, as well as just average. And one of the more critical things with this particular design is that they did introduce adaptation as one of their key elements. So what we have here, the existing shoreline, and then as it moves in closer and closer to the stormwater management facility, these little modular cubes and the structure of the entire system can be shifted back. The neighborhood around it will also be doing shifting as people's homes can't be inhabited anymore. They're being flooded more often. So the entire urban structure is going to be moving, and this kind of design allows the treatment facility to move as well. And in terms of multifunctionality, that final design principle, this is kind of just an aerial shot of what this would look like in a black and white world, where you can have some actual amenity space, turning this not just as a treatment facility where nobody can go, but having it open and having it available and designing it in a manner that's attractive and appealing enough that is actually adding value to your community. That's something that we talk a lot about in development is how can you amenitize your area? I mean, you have your set location and you can only do so much with the houses. What other kind of amenities can you provide to your residents, to your clients, to your tenants? And this is one opportunity. So finally, within this primary article, they did include case studies. So this basically broke down these few existing systems that they looked at and what points they hit and what points they missed. This is the proposed system, the one that they designed, so obviously it hits all the points. But a lot of them do end up missing. The one thing that all of these case studies missed is they're not adaptive. That was one thing that the author said was going to be critical but hadn't really been addressed in a lot of existing situations. And that's, you can see the combined sewer overflow that I was talking about with the different wastewater sources combining in bad conditions. There are a few of them did address that sort of situation. Okay, so moving on is the first supplementary article, taking from those case studies. One of them is done here in the performance of constructed wetland pond system. And this is where we can get into some real-world metrics. It's basically a look at the measured results of one of these systems in Taiwan. So, here's the picture I found at the site. And from the Google Maps, this was the only pond I could see on the campus, so it might be the pond that's in the system, and it's super lovely and attractive, so I hope that it is the one that they're actually using. Basically, what the performance that we were looking at for this system, or that they were looking at in the article, was the pollutant removal performance. Basically, the combination of the physical, chemical, and biological processes, but very specific to this campus environment. And so some of the campus environment characteristics that can translate over to some of the projects that we might be working on in the future. For these kinds of constructed wetland systems, there is a fairly high land requirement. So these might not be something that are feasible in like the center of a city where land is at a premium. But once you get past land cost, they do have a fairly moderate capital cost as opposed to a lot of great infrastructures. Very low energy and low maintenance needs. They very much improve the ecological and social functions. So once again, those amenities, if you're needing to inject amenity into a site. And then they provide those opportunities for reuse. In this case, it's through irrigation. So here's a little bit of a look at what this existing system looks like. Even though this is more diagrammatical, you can kind of see they have very similar characteristics. There's the pump tank that gets the water into the system. These two green rectangles are the equivalent of that area that kind of wound back and forth, the very first wetland ponds that the previous design went through. It also has a larger scenic pond where the water can still out and settle. And then after that, after some extra filtration, then it can go be stored and pumped out for use in the landscape. So, the actual metrics of what this site was able to do in terms of pollutant removal. First of all, the temperature was decreased and the pH was decreased, and the dissolved oxygen within the water was increased. And those are all very good things for water quality. So then all of these percentages are basically the percentage reduction of each of these nutrients or pollutants. So just basically the little blue chunk is all that's left. And all of these are really effective, really efficient removals for the nutrients that we're talking about here. The really, really notable ones, things like suspended solids, that was a very key reduction, as well as phosphorus, and then E. coli and other bacteria within the water. That one was reduced 90 to 99%. I mean, almost like decimated within the water supply. So overall, the system performance of this existing system, there was successful reclamation and reuse, and they were able to use that effluent, basically their cleaned water at the end for irrigation, which saved them immensely. And they did have successful enhancement of the landscape and ecological immunity on this campus. Like you saw from that first image, it certainly wasn't a detractor from the area. Okay, and then the final article is kind of, and now for something completely different. This one is not, as the prior two were talking about a constructed wetlands. This one is talking about adaptation of existing sewer networks. So essentially, this is kind of looking more now at a gray infrastructure water management, which, if you're not, I mean, green infrastructure usually goes with the living components like the wetlands, whereas gray, concrete. But what intrigued me about this article and what made me want to include it was that it was looking at adaptation, whereas most of those other examples weren't, and our primary article thought that that was a really critical component. They were actually looking at it here. So they were looking at some of the big issues facing urban systems, and the big one for this is deterioration of existing infrastructure. So pipes are aging and they're going to need to be replaced, but how can we make that a more efficient process and essentially take care of two birds with one stone, while trying to accommodate for those changes in climate and increases in urban development. So, one of the big keys at the beginning of this, and how this ties back to our more green infrastructure, is that a feasible route in adaptation planning has to combine different measures. Once again, like the energy example, if we're getting all of our energy from one source, then that's not a very feasible route. It's not a very adaptive route. If anything happens, then we're all screwed. But if we have our planning coming from different sources, if we have those decentralized, dispersed green infrastructures, and we're also looking at how we're wisely reinventing our gray water infrastructure, or gray infrastructure, then we have an actual chance at getting some stability. So it mentioned a few of those other routes, for instance, the decentralization, infiltration systems, an overall urban redesign, and then the traditional route to accommodate changes is just to increase your pipe size. But the one that they chose to examine in this article is the rehabilitation. So they were wanting to see if it's possible to adapt the system for the future changes while they're doing the already necessary rehabilitations. So they're already going to have to go in and repair the pipes. How can we make them better for the future? And so they modeled this. This was all based on an existing town, and they modeled based on 4 different variables. First was the rehabilitation rate, which is what percentage of the pipes are being replaced in the town. The percentage was 0.5 as a low rehabilitation rate, up to 2% as a high rehabilitation rate. So not very many of these pipes in terms of overall percentage are getting rehabilitated, but that's a huge difference, and it's actually a huge number in the effectiveness. One of the other variables is the rehabilitation method that they're using. Basically, those are 3 different methods of going in and rehabilitating pipes. They involve just putting a new pipe through the old pipe. So you're just kind of like layering them in, and they just get smaller and smaller the more times you do it. So you're losing your surface area, which is not good. But you get a new pipe, and it's the cheapest. Cured in place is where you're essentially putting a liner inside. So instead of putting a new pipe inside the old pipe, you're just putting a nice shiny new liner in there. An open cut method is where you're actually increasing the diameter of the pipe, which is the most expensive, but in terms of increasing your flood capacity, it's obviously the most effective because you're getting bigger pipes. And then they also accounted for climate change and for urban development. And after they ran their models with those variables, there were a few, I guess, striking conclusions that they came to that were related more towards the other articles and their resilience. First off was kind of the locational aspect that beginning rehabilitation in the city center and then radiating outward was the one that was modeled as most effective for the rehabilitation method. Whereas, if you remember, for constructed wetlands, those are more space-consuming, and so beginning in the city center wouldn't be a feasible option. So this is an opportunity where these two different methods could be layered fairly effectively, whereas the constructed wetlands might be more feasible around the perimeter. This one shouldn't be. They did, in the end, decide that, or I guess come to the conclusion, that using rehabilitation can help stymie the effects of our changing environments. So it does help with the overall adaptation of the system, but not to a significant degree. So once again, this isn't the only thing that they should be doing to try and move forward as their needs are changing. Because, as we move to the second one, or the third one there, the rehabilitation becomes less effective as they start to factor in more of the climate change and more of the urban redistribution. And finally, those three different methods, the more expensive ones, became much less feasible at lower rehabilitation rates. So when cities aren't rehabbing as much of their pipes, then it doesn't make sense for them to use the more expensive methods. And those are the more realistic rates, the lower ones. A lot of cities aren't going to be rehabbing up to 2% of their pipes. So it was just a pretty good lesson in what works for one place isn't going to work in another. So, with that, I'll open it up to discussion.
Questions for Melanie?
Just for one
Okay.
reason. Yeah, okay.
My question is kind of on the odor factor. So I don't know if you've ever been over by like Spring Loop or Gateway Villas here in College Station by the treatment plant. It smells pretty bad. So I'm guessing, I don't know, my question is there any reduction in odor versus a traditional system?
It wasn't a factor, I wondered about that. It wasn't a factor that they considered, but it also wasn't a negative factor for any of the case studies that they, in the first article, well, for instance, that one. All of these existing systems that were in fairly urban contexts were listed as being positive amenities. And so I imagine that, like, okay.
Yeah, they definitely look better.
That there's a certain amount of odor reduction that can come in the pre-storage, and then before it's actually open to the air there.
So is this a sewage treatment plant that you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a traditional sewage treatment plant.
I'm guessing it smells like it.
Yeah. There's a couple of things with respect to that. The traditional sewage treatment plant often stinks because of the chemicals that are mixed to actually break down the solid waste. So, you know your own personal circumstance. If you want to make something really smelly, you can You can mix stuff in it and leave it in people's letterboxes or whatever you do, right? Or you can actually deodorise it so that it doesn't. With these, particularly, these are becoming way more sophisticated where they choose plant species that actually, because they feed at a faster rate on those elements of the solids that stink, it reduces the odour of the place. But, I mean, Melanie's giving, this is a very good outline of these 3 articles, right? There's quite a forensic discussion of this. And she's actually produced graphs there that did not appear in the, like your little circle things. For those of you that read the articles, that makes crystal clear what worked and what sort of underperformed in terms of that.
Yeah, the graphs they had were just silly.
Unintelligent.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're just garbage. Well, I mean, you can read them, but it takes a lot of time. But the thing that I just want to step back a minute. Some of you have probably been to sewage treatment plants, right? Who has never been to a sewage treatment plant? A lot of you? Oh, you've really missed out on something. Because when we were in our undergraduate class, planning class back in Brisbane, we had this bloke, Peter Zahnleiter. His nickname was Zoom, and he played rugby league, and he was like a typical Neanderthal. He had a receding forehead. You could always tell Pete because he had calluses on his fingers from wandering around. And so one of our subjects was infrastructure engineering, and we got to go to the sewage treatment plant down at Luggage Point. And of course, so there's 30 young graduate planning students. We roll up down there, and lo and behold, we all get issued with hard hats, and we're going to be taken on this tour of this thing. And the guy who is taking us around, we didn't know what his name was, he introduces his name as Mr. Brown. So Zoom thinks this is just hilarious because his humour's still sort of toilet humour because he's sort of kindergarten intellectually. And we get halfway around, and Zoom is so consumed by this experience of the sewage treatment plant, he decides to drop his pants and moon Mr. Brown. So, you know, these sewage treatment plants, odours, whatever, lack of intellect, you know, can have strange impacts on people, right? But they're pretty horrible places. Like when you go there, there's ponds of, well, you know what's in there, right? And they basically separate out the solids, and then they dry the beds, and it settles to the bottom, and they scrape it out. And it's a very intensive process. But dealing with wastes like this, you go through what's primary, tertiary, and secondary and tertiary systems. Now, most cities, generally, like developed cities, get to the secondary level, but very few of them get to the tertiary level. The primary level is really just sort of pulling out the solid waste and sort of sanitising the water, and generally by way of a chlorine type base. And then they drain the water off, generally into a river or something, and let the river sort of diffuse it. Generally kills the fish and all the other malarkey that goes with it. With the secondary system, you keep more of it on site, and you actually purify the water. So you start to actually, not only do you deodorise it, but you pull some of those elements out that are described in the second paper. And then the tertiary system, basically the water that is coming out of the plant is almost drinkable water, right? And the solid wastes have actually been collected, and they've been turned into generally a fertiliser type nitrate substitute that you can use for fertilising agricultural land. Very few cities invest in the tertiary solutions. Now, these solutions are really expensive, right? They're expensive in terms of the plant that you produce, but as Melanie points out, in the pipes that you actually put in place to get the effluent from its point of generation to the sewage treatment plant is really expensive. Just putting the capital cost in many cases you'll have to put a pump station in, 1 or 2 pump stations in, probably rising mains as well, and this stuff costs an absolute fortune. Not only to build it, but to maintain it. Because if you've got a lot of these solids moving through a system like that, they tend to silt. So you If you're in an environment like Houston, which is relatively flat, to get the flow velocity through the pipe so you can flush it is really difficult. Now, I think they used an Austrian city, didn't they? Which I imagine probably had much better gradients, right? So it's less of a problem in those circumstances. So the thing you need to understand is, if you're a property developer and they are sheeting home your proportionate cost of this, it is costing you a fortune to do this. Now, you can either pay the capital cost up front, or you can form a MUD and basically push it back onto the landowners, but it's still going to cost you a lot of money in terms of capital cost and then recurrent sort of treatment of it. The sad part about the mains is that once you bury these things, you can't see them. So in terms of capturing money to spend on maintaining the pipes, it's buried. What you can't see, you tend not to worry about until it's cataclysmic. And we're getting quite cataclysmic circumstances developing because our infrastructure is so old, right? And so the examples that Melanie gave you are the three ways that you treat it. One is you actually try and push a PVC liner or pipe through the existing pipes. Basically, you replace them using the right-of-ways or the piping, but that reduces the capacity, right? Or you try and put some sort of resin-based substance in it so it seals the pipe and makes its life a bit longer. But whatever you do like that, again, reduces the capacity of the pipe. And if you have sort of over-serviced, if you're beyond the capacity of the pipe to the point where for an hour every day or so it is at capacity, and a flood event comes along, what happens? You basically wind up with this stuff in your front yard. So it's not a good solution, but we are facing significant problems. So this idea of using the landscape, or these more landscape-based solutions, you're going to see these explored a lot more, particularly in university campuses, which is the example that Melanie gave you, and you're going to see them used more in master plan communities. And it will not be long before MUDs will start to look at these alternative solutions because they're way more cost effective. In terms of the treatment of the effluent, the throughput cost is a lot lower, and the ongoing maintenance costs are a lot lower as well. So in terms of articles that I can guarantee, if you go into master plan communities or you go into university asset planning or something like this, these are the sort of articles that you're going to refer to at some particular point in time just to get your head around how this is actually performed. You got any other questions of Melanie before? Yep.
So, wastewater treatment plants have had to adapt over time to handle people dumping different things down the sink and toilet and whatnot.
Yep.
Are these manufactured wetlands able to handle those sorts of household chemicals and things along those lines?
Well, look, if you put a really toxic chemical into a natural environment, what are you going to do? You kill it, right? So, I mean, you've got to be very careful, but you've got to be careful in sewage treatment plants as well. I mean, if some idiot puts something in the system and you don't pick it up at the point of entry, and it basically kills all the cultures that you've got in the higher levels, like the tertiary, upper secondary and tertiary levels, then you just got to flush that out and start again.
So they have systems, I guess, in place?
Absolutely. Yeah. Basically, they test the material that's coming in. Often they'll have sort of holding tanks or holding facilities before they'll actually release it. And of course, that's the reason a lot of them stink, because a lot of those holding tanks are surface tanks, and most people traditionally don't want to buy a house next to a sewage treatment plant for the very reason that Jason pointed out, And in developing nations, they don't, I mean, you're lucky if you've got primary treatment, you just all run straight into the river, and then, you have people washing in the river and pulling drinking water out of it, and you got E. coli and all sorts of horrible stuff going on.
And another kind of layer on that is the level of sophistication of our separation of our waters is improving. We were going from having the combined sewer overflow situation from like the olden days, then we figured out that isn't really a good idea. And now even A lot of times the source water can be separated, whether it's coming from a sink or a shower versus coming from a toilet or like an industrial situation. So having those separations where you have much more control over what is actually entering into the system in the first place. That's existing much more. And now that as cities are having to redevelop their infrastructure, they're starting to do it a little bit more intelligently.
Okay, thanks, Melanie.